March 12, 1943, 0430 hours, somewhere between Tibesa and the Kasserine Pass, North Africa. The desert is still dark, no stars, no moon, just a suffocating blackness that erases the horizon. A thin convoy of U.S. Army medical trucks rattles across the uneven track, suspension groaning, engines gasping for breath in the cold. The only light comes from the faint red glow of covered dashboard lamps. Private Walter Gaines, crammed into the passenger seat of the lead truck, wipes grit from his eyes. His fingers tremble, not from fear, but from exhaustion. 36 hours awake, 36 hours running supplies to field hospitals fighting to keep their own hearts beating. Beside him, the driver mutters, "Road's getting worse." Gaines looks ahead. He can barely see the dust plume behind the convo. Everything feels like a bad dream. Too quiet, too cold, too still. And then he hears it, a distant mechanical howl, growing louder, closer, a Messerschmitt. "Down!" someone screams. A streak of fire rips across the sky as the fighter dives, guns blazing. Bullets stitch the sand, sparking off metal. Men scramble from the trucks, diving into ditches. A crate ruptures, plasma bottles shatter like tiny glass hearts. The ambulance at the rear takes a direct hit. An explosion of steam and flame. The driver collapses in the doorway, smoke curling around his uniform. Gaines hits the ground hard. Sand fills his mouth. He lifts his head just in time to see the Messerschmitt banking for another pass. The desert trembles beneath him. Somewhere in the dark, someone prays. The second run is worse, lower, angrier. Bullets whip through canvas. Tires burst. Men drag crates toward whatever rocks they can find, their breath ragged with panic. The fighter screams overhead and vanishes into the black. Silence returns in fragments, broken, uneven, trembling like the men trying to stand. The convoy is wrecked. The ambulance is gone. Half the medical crates are shattered. Gaines pulls himself up, coughing dust, staring at the wreckage. "God," he whispers, "how are we supposed to save anyone now?" He doesn't have the answer. But hundreds of miles away in Algiers, someone is about to rewrite the answer entirely. 2 days earlier, Lieutenant Colonel Florence Aby Blanchfield walked through the chaotic corridors of the North African Medical Headquarters with a stack of conflicting reports under her arm. Supplies missing, supplies duplicated, supplies spoiled in the sun, surgeons begging for plasma while warehouses recorded surplus. Nothing made sense. She stepped into a cramped planning room. A captain tried to look busy as she spread the papers across the table. "These reports don't match," she said calmly. "Hospitals say they're short. Depots say they're full." The captain shrugged. "It's a war zone, ma'am. Everything's unreliable." "No," she replied, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "Our system is unreliable, and if we don't fix it, men will keep dying before they ever reach surgery." The captain hesitated. "With respect, Lieutenant Colonel, the supply chain is too big to reorganize." "Not out here." She lifted her eyes. "Then we reorganize it anyway." Those words, quiet, controlled, precise, would become the fuse that detonated the largest medical logistics overhaul in U.S. Army history. Blanchfield wasn't a general. She wasn't a combat officer. She wasn't even recognized with full military rank. But she saw something no one else did. The wounded didn't die from lack of courage. They died from lack of organization. And she would not allow it to continue. Back in the desert, as sunrise bled across the sky, Gaines and the others coaxed the battered convoy back onto the track. They moved slowly, limping toward the field hospital that was waiting, desperate, depleted, unaware of how close it came to catastrophe. They didn't know that a woman they'd never met had just begun reshaping their world. A woman who believed that chaos could be conquered, that precision could save more lives than firepower, that logistics could win battles as surely as bullets. They didn't know her name yet, but they would. Because Blanchfield was about to turn the entire medical supply chain, from North Africa to Italy, into the backbone of Allied survival. The convoy crawled forward through the rising heat. Change was coming, and the war would never be the same. March 1943, Algiers, North Africa. The port never slept. Cranes groaning under the weight of cargo nets, forklifts whining across the docks, boots thudding against planks slick with seawater. Ships were unloading around the clock, stacked high with crates stamped in black ink: medical, rations, plasma, surgical, emergency. To the average officer, it looked like order. To Lieutenant Colonel Florence Blanchfield, it looked like chaos waiting to kill someone. She moved through the port depot with the posture of someone who had no time to waste. Nurses saluted. Quartermasters gave polite nods. A few officers muttered behind her back, "That woman again. The dietitian thinks she runs the place." She ignored all of it. Her eyes were fixed on the manifests. And the manifests were a disaster. Crates mislabeled. Dates scratched out and rewritten. plasma stored incorrectly, food stacked above morphine, bandages marked as miscellaneous linen. She knelt beside a pallet and pulled open a crate. Inside were bedpans. The label read sulfa powder. She exhaled, slow, controlled, infuriated. This wasn't merely inefficient, this was lethal. Later that night, she sat in a stifling headquarters room, surrounded by stacks of conflicting reports. A single electric fan buzzed from a corner, pushing hot air nowhere useful. Captain Harlow entered carrying a mug of sour, burnt coffee. "Ma'am, you've been at this all day." "All day isn't enough," she replied, not looking up. He set the mug beside her. "It's not your fault. The system isn't a system," she finished sharply. "It's guesswork, wishful thinking, and men like Gaines pay the price." Harlow hesitated. "You think there's a fix?" Blanchfield stopped writing. Slowly, she lifted her head. "There's always a fix. Chaos is just someone refusing to take responsibility for order." She stood, walked to the wall map, and began pinning lines between depots, convoys, hospitals, ports. Harlow watched, confused at first, then increasingly stunned. "You're building," he murmured. "A new chain?" "A real chain," she corrected. "Not a maze." She pointed at the map, her voice rising with urgency. "Right now, hospitals are waiting days for supplies that are sitting 10 miles away. Drivers don't know what they're carrying. Surgeons don't know what to expect. We lose lives not because we're outmatched," she tapped a pin sharply, "but because we're unorganized." Harlow stared at the map. "If you're right, this changes everything." "I'm not right," she replied. "I'm late." The next morning, Blanchfield stepped into a meeting of high-ranking officers who had not invited her. The room fell silent. Her presence wasn't unwelcome, just inconvenient. Colonel Jameson, a stiff man with a stiff mustache, set down his pen. "Lieutenant Colonel Blanchfield, we're discussing logistical flow for Operation Torch follow-ups. This is a quartermaster meeting." She held up a stack of reports. "Your convoys are delivering the wrong supplies to the wrong units at the wrong time." Whispers erupted around the table. Jameson bristled. "Now see here." Blanchfield laid the reports neatly before him. "A hospital at Tebessa requested plasma. You sent blankets. Another needed sulfa. You sent flour. A surgical station asked for morphine." She slid the third sheet forward. "You sent nothing at all." Jameson flushed red. "What exactly are you implying? That we need to rebuild this system before it collapses completely?" The room went still. Then one major scoffed. "Rebuild? Madam, with respect, that's impossible." She looked him dead in the eyes. "Impossible is not an argument, it's an excuse." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Whitmore, a general known for his cold pragmatism, tapped the edge of Blanchfield's reports. "And what do you propose, Lieutenant Colonel?" She stepped to the map on the wall. The same mess of lines she had seen last night. "We start with visibility," she said. "Every crate logged, every convoy scheduled, every hospital updated. One chain, one doctrine, one language." Jameson scoffed. "You want centralization in a war zone?" "I want accountability," she corrected, "because men are dying from paperwork." The officers exchanged glances, some annoyed, some intrigued. Whitmore leaned back. "And you believe you can do this?" "I believe," she said steadily, "that no one else will." Whitmore stared at her for a long moment. "Very well," he said finally. "Draft your plan. Present it in 72 hours. Dyer, another colonel, hissed under his breath. "You can't be serious." Whitmore didn't look at him. "I'm deadly serious." Blanchfield saluted, turned, and walked out, calm, composed, relentless. Harlow hurried after her. 72 hours? "That's not enough," she said. "Then how will you?" She didn't slow. "We won't sleep." For the next 3 days, she built the skeleton of an entirely new Allied medical supply doctrine. New forms, new labels, new routing logic, new cold storage protocols, new convoy discipline, new field-level tracking. She planned for deserts, for mountains, for mud, for air raids, for chaos, because chaos was the enemy she knew best. On the third night, she pinned the final copy of her proposal to the board. Harlow stared at it, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Ma'am, if this works, you'll save thousands." She didn't smile. "No," she said gently. "If it works, we will." Across the desert, Gaines and the battered convoy finally crawled toward the field hospital, sunburned, bruised, exhausted, carrying too little, arriving too late. He didn't know it, none of them did, but this would be the last time the system failed them so completely. Because Florence Blanchfield had just declared war on the chaos behind the lines, and she fully intended to win. March 1943. Algiers headquarters. The briefing tent was already full when Lieutenant Colonel Florence Blanchfield walked in, rows of officers stiff in their chairs, arms crossed, expressions hardened into polite hostility. They weren't here to collaborate, they were here to stop her. At the front of the room, General Whitmore cleared his throat. This meeting will review Lieutenant Colonel Blanchfield's proposed reorganization of the theater medical supply system. A low murmur rippled across the audience. Reorganization sounded too much like revolution. Jameson, red-faced, leaned back with hands clasped over his belly. Dyer, his closest ally, sat forward like a man ready to strike the moment she stumbled. Blanchfield placed her folders on the table. She didn't stumble. She opened with the numbers. Current casualty mortality from delayed treatment, 31%. She flipped a page. Current plasma spoilage rate, nearly 20%. Another page. Average delivery time for critical supplies, between 54 and 88 hours. The tent shifted uneasily. Even the hostile officers didn't dispute the numbers. They lived them. Dyer forced a smirk. War is unpredictable, Lieutenant Colonel. You can't schedule chaos. No, she replied sharply, but we can stop contributing to it. She unrolled a map across the table, a web of lines erased and redrawn, simplified and clarified until the chain became something recognizable, almost elegant. This, she said, pointing, is what we have, a mess. And this, she said, flipping a second map over it, is what we could have. The room fell silent. Where there had been snarls of meaningless roads and overlapping depot networks, there were now straight lines, clear staging points, predictable flows, a structure ready to absorb the shock of war instead of amplifying it. Harlow, at the back, watched the officers' eyes change, skepticism giving way to something they would never admit. Hope. Jameson coughed, clearly rattled. You're asking for too much authority. Too many changes. New forms, new labels, new routing procedures. This is a battlefield, not a hospital kitchen, and men on the battlefield bleed out while we debate labels, she replied. Whitmore's eyebrows lifted, not in disapproval, but recognition. Dyer seized the moment. Sir, she's a dietitian, a nurse. She cannot understand the scale of. Blanchfield stepped forward. Colonel, she said quietly but firmly, do not mistake compassion for ignorance. Nurses understand scale better than anyone, because we watched the consequences of your paperwork arrive on stretchers. That landed like a shell burst. Some officers actually flinched. Whitmore lifted a hand. Lieutenant Colonel, what is the core of your proposal? She answered without hesitation. One chain, one standard, one language, one accountable system from port to patient. And you believe, Whitmore asked, that you can make this function in an active combat theater? No, she said. A pause. I believe we already have no choice. The tent went silent. Whitmore studied the map for a long, still moment. Then he nodded once. You have conditional approval to implement Phase 1. Jameson's jaw fell open. Dyer muttered a curse. Blanchfield saluted crisply, her expression calm, but inside her pulse hammered. Phase 1 meant she could test her system. Prove it. Scale it. Harlow caught up with her outside. Ma'am, Phase 1? That's not enough, she said, but enough to begin. He exhaled. You know they'll fight you. She looked back at the tent, where her skeptics were already murmuring furiously. They already are, she replied, but the wounded are fighting harder, and they deserve better weapons. Phase 1 began before dawn the next morning. Blanchfield walked the depot floors with a clipboard, retraining clerks who had never seen a standardized requisition before. She showed drivers exactly what each crate label meant. She reorganized the cold storage processes for plasma so it wouldn't spoil in desert heat. She cross-checked manifests until her fingers cramped. At midday, she was inspecting a shipment of morphine when a quartermaster sergeant approached, nervous and sweaty. Ma'am, the men say you're trying to change everything. No, she replied without looking up. I'm trying to fix everything. The sergeant hesitated. And if it doesn't work? She closed the crate lid slowly, deliberately. Then men die, she said, and I won't let that happen. A week later, the first real test came. A field hospital outside GAFSA requested emergency plasma. Under the old system, it would take 48 hours, if it arrived at all. Under Blanchfield's new chain, 12 hours, 37 minutes. When the convoy arrived, on time, fully equipped, perfectly labeled, the surgeons stared in stunned disbelief. This can't be right, one murmured as he opened a crate. Nothing's missing. For the first time since landing in North Africa, they had what they needed before they were desperate for it. Word spread fast, through tents, through mess halls, through exhausted medics stitching wounds under lantern light. The chain was working, her chain, but the success only intensified the backlash. 2 days later, Blanchfield returned to her desk to find a formal complaint waiting, Dyer's handwriting all over it. Her procedures undermine long-standing Army doctrine. She is overreaching her position. Recommendations, immediate review and suspension. Harlow's face turned red. Ma'am, he's trying to bury you. She set the paper down. He's trying, she said quietly, but he won't, because the chain had momentum now. and truth had momentum. And nothing spreads faster among the wounded than the knowledge that someone is fighting for them. Her reforms had begun, and soon they would collide with the largest amphibious operation in modern military history. July 10, 1943, 0440 hours, off the southern coast of Sicily. Dark waves slapped against the sides of the landing craft, spraying cold salt water across the helmets of the men packed shoulder to shoulder. Engines growled underfoot. The sky was a heavy charcoal gray, a storm without rain, a dawn without light. A medic named Peter Laskin gripped his aid bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They say the hospitals are stocked this time," he murmured to no one in particular. "They say the chain's fixed." A veteran beside him snorted. "Kid, chains don't fix themselves." But he was wrong. A woman had fixed it. Laskin just didn't know her name yet. The ramp dropped with a violent splash. Gunfire tore through the surf. Medics sprinted through water up to their waists, dragging wounded men toward shattered dunes. Explosions punched holes in the sand. Smoke poured across the beach like a living thing. In under 10 minutes, the aid stations were overwhelmed. The senior medic shouted, "We're out of plasma already?" Under the old system, that would have been true. But moments later, an LST beached hard on the shore, its hull screeching. Its ramp slammed down, and there they were, crates, perfectly labeled, perfectly organized, perfectly packed. Every medic froze. This is everything we asked for," Laskin whispered, pulling open a crate of sulfa. "Every unit." "Who planned this?" the veteran asked, stunned. Nobody had an answer. Not yet. Back in North Africa, 0300 hours, Florence Blanchfield stood before a radio console inside a dimly lit warehouse headquarters. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hair was pinned back with battlefield practicality. She hadn't slept in almost 40 hours. A radio operator called out, "Ma'am, request from surgical teams on Beach Sector Red. They need more dressings and plasma ASAP. Forward the request to Depot B7, she said calmly. Load Route 6. Triple check crate seals. Priority 1. Harlow approached with 2 dispatches in hand. The landing's chaos, but the supplies are hitting the shore exactly as scheduled. She allowed a small exhale. Good. That means the chain is holding. Harlow shook his head. Ma'am, I've never seen anything like this. This is what logistics is supposed to look like. She didn't answer. She simply marked another convoy route with red pencil, her movements steady, controlled, relentless. Because this wasn't victory. This was only verification. Her system was working under fire, and Sicily was just the beginning. On the beach, Laskin tore open a crate stamped surgical small unit, Priority C. Inside were precisely packed instruments, sterile, wrapped, accounted for. This isn't luck, Laskin whispered, cutting open a plasma tin with his teeth. Someone planned every second of this. A shell exploded nearby. The shockwave knocked the wind out of him, but he kept working, because for once, he wasn't rationing hope. He had enough. They all had enough. By nightfall, casualty stabilization teams behind the dunes were operating with full supply loads, something unheard of in previous invasions. Lieutenant Commander Elise Harmon, overseeing a floating surgical bay aboard an LST, flipped through a manifest and blinked. Accurate, she whispered. Every item, every quantity, no shortages. A surgeon beside her wiped sweat from his brow. Whoever built this system ought to run the whole damn war. She didn't respond aloud, but she knew, the name written in tiny, precise handwriting on her manifest sheets. F. A. Blanchfield. Back in the operations room, Blanchfield listened to the incoming reports. Her eyes flicked across the supply map, lines of movement, timings, medical priorities. Report from Palermo sector, a clerk said, handing her a paper. Field hospital is stable. 0 shortages. She took it, read it, nodded once. Another clerk approached. Message from Red Beach. All convoys confirmed. Another. Casualty rates high, but supplies holding. Another. Drops successful at all planned sites. With each report, her chain grew stronger, not physically, but psychologically, because the medical corps finally believed, and belief moved as fast as fear. Harlow approached quietly. Ma'am, they're calling it the Blanchfield chain. She didn't look up from her maps. That's unnecessary, she said. Harlow smiled faintly. Not to the ones it saved. She kept tracing convoy paths with her pencil, but her voice softened, almost imperceptibly. What matters, she said, is that the system worked. Now we see if it can scale. Harlow blinked. Scale? Ma'am, Sicily's enormous. Sicily, she replied, is small. Italy is the test, and after Italy, Europe. Harlow stared at her like she was speaking of a future no one else could see. But she saw it clearly. The chain wasn't just holding, it was evolving. And the next stage of the war, mountains, winter, famine, floods, would require something far stronger The next stage would decide if her system was a miracle or a fluke. September 1943, Salerno, Italy. The first thing the medics noticed was the mud. Not ordinary mud, but a sucking, clinging, boot-stealing swamp that swallowed trucks whole and turned every step into a battle. Rain hammered the beachhead in sheets. Smoke drifted low to the ground. German artillery shrieked through the fog with uncanny accuracy. A young medic shouted over the storm, "We're out of plasma already! We'll lose half these men before dawn!" A surgeon snapped back, "Convoys are stuck in the passes! Unless someone moves mountains, nothing's coming!" But someone was moving mountains, quietly, relentlessly, from hundreds of miles away. Her name was Florence Blanchfield, and Italy was about to become her crucible. Naples, 48 hours earlier, Blanchfield stood at the center of a ruined hospital-turned-headquarters. A topographic map of southern Italy stretched across a surgery table. The map looked like a nightmare: mountains, valleys, choke points, washed-out roads, blown bridges, perfect terrain for chaos. Harlow entered soaked to the shoulders. "Ma'am, engineers say the main supply routes are impassable. Mudslides, collapsed culverts, German mines. We can't get convoys through." She didn't look up. "Then they're using the wrong routes." Harlow blinked. "Ma'am, there are no other routes." "There are," she corrected, tracing two thin ridges with her pencil. "But they're not roads." "Not yet." He stared at the map. "Those are goat paths." She finally met his eyes. "Then we need goats." By nightfall, Blanchfield had mobilized an improvised task force: engineers, mule drivers, Italian mountain guides, and a handful of medics willing to risk their lives hauling medical supplies over terrain so steep it made seasoned soldiers nauseous. The engineers protested. The quartermasters balked. The officers scoffed. She ignored them all. "War doesn't wait for perfect roads," she said. "Neither will we." Dawn, the Salerno front. A mule team emerged from the fog like ghosts, silhouettes against the rain-soaked ridge. Strapped to their backs were crates of plasma, sulfa, surgical kits, blankets, and morphine, each bundle wrapped with Blanchfield's new shockproof, moisture-safe packing. The medics stared. "You've got to be kidding me," one whispered. "Mules?" The lead Italian guide grinned. "Orders from the American lady." "What lady?" He shrugged. "The one who says impossible things are possible." Minutes later, the first plasma unit reached a surgeon who had been forced to choose which wounded men were treatable and which were beyond saving. He lifted the container with shaking hands. "Bless her," he whispered. He didn't know her name, but he blessed her anyway. Naples headquarters. Harlow burst into the operations room, boots dripping mud. "Ma'am, the mule teams made it through. Supplies reached Salerno before sunrise." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased half an inch. "Good," she said. "Reroute the next wave. Expand the ridge strategy." Harlow stared at her. "Ma'am, no other logistics officer on Earth would have tried that." "No other logistics officer," she replied, "has seen what I've seen." Her eyes drifted to the wall. Rows of casualty reports from North Africa, Sicily, and now Italy. Each number was a story she refused to let end early. Italy only got worse. The mountains rose higher. The weather sank colder. The fighting grew slower, bloodier, more intimate. Convoys got stuck in sleet. Rivers flooded roads. German counterattacks shattered bridges. But Blanchfield adapted faster than the chaos. She created mobile reserve depots that leapfrogged forward with the infantry. She built Alpine-specific kits that fit on mules or men. She established rolling reorganizations, where supply points were packed and moved within hours. She wrote night transport protocols, allowing convoys to move under the cover of darkness with near-surgical precision. Every adaptation saved lives. Every improvement strengthened the chain, and word spread. Medics began saying it openly. "If you need something, ask Blanchfield. She'll find a way. She always does." Her chain was becoming legend, but the backlash grew too. Colonel Dyer confronted her outside a depot one afternoon, boots splashing in fresh mud. "You're out of control," he snapped. "Convoys rerouted without authorization, supplies redistributed without quartermaster approval, engineers reassigned without documentation. You're acting like you command every logistics unit in Italy." She didn't flinch. "Colonel," she said softly, "I command nothing. I coordinate everything. And coordination is what saves the wounded. You keep forgetting." His face reddened. "You're violating protocol." "I'm rewriting it," she corrected. "Not your place." She stepped closer, voice low but lethal. "It becomes my place," she said. "When the old way costs lives." He had no answer, because she was right. Every medic on the line knew it. Every surgeon knew it. And soon, even the generals would know it. By winter, Italy became the proving ground she hadn't asked for but needed. Her system didn't break. It adapted. It flexed. It endured. And as the Allies punched their way north toward Rome, one truth became undeniable. Blanchfield's chain wasn't a miracle, it was a machine. A machine built from discipline, compassion, fury, and brilliance. A machine ready for something far bigger than Italy. Because the greatest test of her life, the largest invasion in history, was just months away, and her system would decide who lived long enough to see liberation. January 1944, Caserta, Italy. The former royal palace, once a jewel of Bourbon opulence, had been consumed by war. Marble floors were hidden beneath maps, cables, fuel-stained tarps. Crystal chandeliers hung above rows of typewriters clacking with relentless urgency. Every hallway smelled of wet wool, ink, and exhaustion. And in the center of this storm stood the woman the medical corps now whispered about in foxholes and field tents, Lieutenant Colonel Florence Aby Blanchfield. Italy was nearly secured. The next phase would be bigger than anything the Allies had attempted, an operation so massive it would require more precision than any logistics system had ever delivered. And the Supreme Command wanted her to design the medical backbone for all of it. General Whitmore met her in a high-ceiling room where portraits of dead kings stared down at her with blank, regal indifference. He gestured to the giant map pinned across the wall. England, the Channel, France's northern coast. Blanchfield, he said without preamble, this is the biggest coordinated military effort in the history of the world. We need a medical logistics doctrine that won't collapse under it. She studied the map, the beaches, the air routes, the supply loops, the evacuation lines, the thousands upon thousands of stretchers that would fill the sand within hours. What she saw wasn't impossible. What she saw was structure waiting to be built. When do you need it? She asked. Yesterday, Whitmore muttered. She nodded once. Then we begin now. For weeks, the palace became her war laboratory. Harlow watched with a mix of awe and fear as she worked 18-hour days, surrounded by stacks of manifests and terrain analyses. She redrafted entire distribution plans at 1 in the morning. She corrected convoy timing patterns at 3. She reorganized airborne medical supply doctrine at dawn. To anyone else, the scale would have been crushing. To her, it was clarity. She divided the future invasion force into medical echelons, each one connected to the next like vertebrae. Echelon 1, frontline medics with kits designed for seconds count trauma. Echelon 2, aid stations with new standardized resupply bundles. Echelon 3, mobile surgical units with precision loadouts. Echelon 4, evacuation hospitals staged for movement. Echelon 5, base hospitals with strategic reserves. No more guessing. No more improvising. No more chaos. A living, breathing organism, one that pulsed with the rhythm of war. One night, long after most staff had collapsed onto cots or rolled blankets, Harlow approached her as she traced a supply route with her pencil. Ma'am, be honest. Do you think this can work? At this scale? She didn't look away from the map. It has to, she said. And if it doesn't? She set the pencil down. If it doesn't, the invasion fails, and thousands die who didn't need to. Harlow swallowed hard. No pressure then. She allowed a brief smile. The pressure helps. Then she returned to work. Her blueprint grew bolder. She designed preloaded hospital ships that could receive the wounded within minutes of beach capture. She created floating surgical supply nodes staged offshore. She wrote redundancy protocols so every critical supply had not one backup, but 4. She built cross-theater communication codes that even exhausted medics could understand at a glance. She demanded nursing units be given authority equal to quartermasters within the chain, an unprecedented push. Dyer called her plan intrusive. Jameson called it unrealistic. A few generals called it impossible. But the surgeons on the front? They called it salvation. Finally, after weeks of relentless effort, Blanchfield stood before the Supreme Command to present her plan. Every officer looked up as she entered. Maps and papers covered the long table like the surface of a warship. Whitmore nodded for her to begin. She did not waste a second. She walked them through the chain, layer by layer, artery by artery, until even the skeptics leaned forward to follow her logic. She didn't pitch, she didn't plead, she explained, and every explanation cut another slice out of doubt. When she finished, the room was silent. Whitmore finally exhaled. Lieutenant Colonel, this is the most ambitious logistics architecture I've ever seen, Dyer muttered, or overreach in disguise. Whitmore ignored him. This system, the general said slowly, isn't just functional, it's historic. Then he turned to her. It's approved, all of it, effective immediately. Some officers stiffened, a few protested. Harlow grinned like someone who'd been holding his breath for a month, and Blanchfield, calm, centered, resolute, simply bowed her head. Thank you, sir. But inside her chest, something immense shifted. The chain wasn't just a battlefield advantage anymore. It was the blueprint for victory. Later that afternoon, As she stood alone in a quiet hallway, Harlow approached. "What now, ma'am?" She looked toward the windows, where late sunlight spilled across the marble like spilled gold. "Now," she said, "we prepare for Normandy. The next operation wouldn't be just another battle. It would be the turning point of the century, and her system would determine who lived long enough to fight it." June 6, 1944, 0622 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The surf churned red. Waves crashed over shattered landing craft. Smoke drifted across the sand in thick, choking sheets. Machine gun fire tore the air into shreds. Medics clawed their way across the beach, dragging wounded men behind steel hedgehogs, praying their stretchers wouldn't drop. And then came the moment no medic ever forgot. A lieutenant screamed, "We're already low on plasma. We need—" A young corporal cut him off, holding up a crate. "Sir, we have it. All of it." The lieutenant blinked. He'd expected the familiar fear, that sickening certainty that supplies had gone missing, mislabeled, or destroyed somewhere between England and the surf. But instead he opened a crate to find plasma, morphine syringes, tourniquets, dressings, shock blankets, sterile packs, everything. Every item was labeled cleanly. Every load matched the manifest perfectly. Every supply was where it needed to be, before it was needed. In the middle of hell, the impossible had happened. The chain had held. Southern England, hours earlier, Florence Blanchfield stood in the medical operations tent, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Radio operators relayed frantic updates from the beaches. Cries, coordinates, code words, casualty estimates that twisted her gut. Harlow approached with a trembling dispatch. "Ma'am, the first reports from Omaha are bad, very bad." She swallowed once. Her voice stayed steady. "Then we hold the line." Her hands gripped the table map as if stabilizing a patient on the operating table. "Send the secondary plasma reserves across immediately, and the third wave if necessary." Harlow blinked. "Ma'am, that's our entire buffer. No wounded man," she said, "should die because we were afraid to open a crate." He nodded and sprinted to the radio station. Omaha Beach, 0800 hours. Medics were operating behind dunes, their voices rasping from smoke and exhaustion. But for the first time in any major landing, they weren't rationing their supplies. They weren't improvising. They weren't begging. They were working. A medic stabilized a severely wounded private using fresh plasma and whispered, "Whoever planned this, thank them for me." Another medic shouted across the din, "We're not out yet. Keep it moving." Even the surgeons were stunned. "This supply chain is inhuman," one said, reloading a surgical kit. Another corrected him. "No, it's superhuman." Aboard a hospital ship off the coast, Lieutenant Commander Elise Harmon stood in a triage bay brimming with wounded men. For once, triage wasn't a guessing game, because her shelves were full. Surgical needles, sutures, antibiotics, litter straps, all present, all ready. She flipped through a manifest, tears stinging her eyes, not from emotion, but from the raw shock of seeing everything accounted for. "Who did this?" a young nurse asked. "How did we get so lucky?" Harmon closed the manifest softly. "It wasn't luck." Back in England, Blanchfield listened to the radio's crackle with updates. "Supplies steady at Omaha, Utah stable. No shortages. Evac ships loaded and returning with full manifest integrity." Full manifest integrity. Words she had fought years to hear. She closed her eyes just long enough to breathe, then snapped back to work. "Reinforce transport routes Charlie and Fox," she ordered. "Move Field Hospital 23C forward by 1900 hours. Ensure the rail line staging for evacuated casualties is staffed with double shifts." Her system wasn't just functioning. It was alive, a living organism, feeding the invasion with exactly what it needed, exactly when it needed it. Harlow approached hours later, voice soft. "Ma'am, you should know. The surgeons on the beach. They're calling it the Blanchfield miracle." She didn't look up from her map. "No," she corrected. "It's the supply chain doing its job. Ma'am, with respect, you built that chain." She paused, pencil hovering. "For the wounded," she said quietly, "and for the ones who never made it this far." Her voice cracked, barely, but she steadied it before it broke. Because today wasn't a day for breaking. Today was a day for holding the line. Normandy, D+1 through D+5. The beaches turned into roads. The roads turned into corridors. The corridors turned into arteries pumping men, equipment, and, most importantly, hope inland. Through every hour of the invasion, Blanchfield's chain didn't break. It adapted, flexed, expanded. Every medic and surgeon felt it. Every wounded soldier owed it their survival. And by the time the beachheads held and the Allied armies surged forward toward France, one truth became undeniable. The invasion succeeded because the men were brave, but they survived because Blanchfield's chain was stronger than chaos. Her system had done more than support the invasion. It had defined it. But now came the hardest question of all. Would the army let the chain survive after the war? Or would bureaucrats tear it down the moment the guns fell silent? Florence Blanchfield already knew the answer, not if she had anything to say about it. May 1945, Munich, Germany. The war was gasping its final breaths. Smoke floated over a ruined city like the last exhale of a dying giant. Soldiers wandered streets that no longer had names. Medics moved through crowds of liberated civilians and freed prisoners, handing out blankets, bandages, and food from crates marked with a familiar, precise handwriting. F.A. Blanchfield. Her chain had gotten them here, across deserts, mountains, beaches, and battlefields, through every disaster and every assault, through fire and winter and darkness. But now came the moment she feared most. Peace. Peace, she knew, had a terrible habit. It made people forget why systems mattered, why order mattered, why discipline mattered, why logistics mattered. Peace made men nostalgic for the very chaos that had nearly destroyed them, and Florence Blanchfield refused to let her work die quietly. Caserta headquarters, 2 weeks after VE Day. Blanchfield stood before a table of senior officers, most of whom were already thinking about going home. Dyer was there, still bristling from a war that had proven him wrong. Jameson, older and quieter now. Whitmore, the only one whose attention remained razor-sharp. Gentlemen, Blanchfield began, you know the results. North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine. The chain held in every campaign. Several officers nodded reluctantly. She continued, voice steady as stone. But this system will disappear unless we secure it in doctrine, permanently. Dyer scoffed loudly. Doctrine? Lieutenant Colonel, the war is over. We don't need this level of control anymore. She didn't raise her voice. We didn't need it. Until men started dying because we didn't have it. He opened his mouth, but she cut him off with a calm ferocity that froze the room. The wounded don't care about your comfort, she said. They care that plasma reaches them before they bleed out. They care that a mislabeled crate doesn't kill a man more effectively than the enemy. She laid a hand on a stack of reports, thousands of pages, countless miracles. This, she said, isn't wartime improvisation. This is the future of military medicine. Whitmore nodded. Explain. She took a breath. We must do 3 things. 1. Formally adopt the medical supply chain as permanent doctrine. No more improvisation in the next war. No more guessing. 2. Grant full military status to nurses. Rank, authority, command rights. They proved themselves across every battlefield. 3. Build a standing medical logistics corps. Professionals trained in this system, not volunteers drowned in chaos. Dyer slammed his fist onto the table. This is absurd. A nurse rewriting army structure? Her eyes didn't flinch. A nurse, she said, prevented thousands of deaths you would have otherwise explained away as fog of war. The room went cold. For a moment, no one moved. Then Whitmore leaned forward. Gentlemen, he said, let's speak plainly. Blanchfield's system saved this army. You all know it. You saw it. You benefited from it. He tapped the table once, sharply. This is not her proposal. This is necessity. No one dared argue with the man who had commanded 3 theaters of war. Finally, slowly, Jameson nodded. Then another officer. And another. Dyer sat rigid, jaw clenched. But even he couldn't fight the truth. Whitmore turned to her. Lieutenant Colonel Blanchfield, he said, your recommendations are approved. All of them. Her jaw tightened. Not in shock, but in relief. She saluted sharply. Thank you, sir. July 1945, Washington, D.C. The corridors of the War Department echoed with footsteps, typewriters, and the restless buzz of a nation transitioning from war to peace. Blanchfield walked those halls with a new purpose. Not to save the wounded, but to protect the ones who had saved them. She testified before committees. She argued before generals. She battled bureaucrats who called the system too complex, too expensive, or unnecessary in peacetime. She corrected them every time. Complexity saves lives. Efficiency reduces costs. And peacetime, she said, is when we prepare for what comes next. She fought not for glory, not for recognition, but for permanence, and she won. The Army adopted her medical logistics doctrine. Nurses gained full commissioned officer status. The modern U.S. Army Nurse Corps was born, because Florence Blanchfield refused to let the sacrifices of wartime vanish when the guns fell silent. Years later, veterans who had survived Omaha Beach, Casino, Bastogne, and the Rhine would tell their children and grandchildren stories about mud, fire, screaming skies, and the nurses who never left their side. They rarely mentioned the supply crates, the manifests, the standardized labels, the perfectly packed plasma, the convoys that arrived. Somehow, just in time, But every survivor owed something to the woman they never met. The one whose name rarely appeared in the headlines. The one who fought chaos with clipboards, maps, and sleepless nights. The one who believed that logistics could be an act of compassion. Florence Blanchfield's impossible plan didn't just feed an army, it saved one. And it built the backbone of the medical systems the military still uses today. Not because she asked permission, but because she refused to accept failure. And because somewhere on some battlefield, there was always a soldier whispering the same quiet prayer. Please, let the supplies get here in time. Thanks to her, they did.